Hi, my name is James Coltrain. I'm the founder and lead developer at Historiated Games, a studio focused on historically themed games. I'm also a history PhD and a former history professor, and currently a professor of game art at the University of Connecticut. And I'm here to talk to you about the experience I had making our first game, Blackhaven. Blackhaven was released in the summer of 2021, and it follows a student named Kendra Turner as she uncovers a trail of secrets and misdeeds at a colonial plantation museum. Historiated is also tiny. On the technical end, it's a solo dev operation. I do all the research, art, coding, and audio, but as you'll see, the most important parts of Blackhaven were very much a team effort. The game was originally intended to be a small free teaser for a larger game called Cassius, a first-person narrative puzzle game taking place in a colonial American plantation estate called Blackhaven Hall. Cassius came out of my experience teaching American history, and I had worked with a team of other scholars to help craft a story that might teach about the relationship of slavery to America's founding. Blackhaven, on the other hand, was inspired by experiences I had researching Cassius in places like Williamsburg, Virginia, where the history of slavery should be central. In the 18th century, enslaved people made up half the population of the colony's capital and about 40% of Virginia's population, hundreds of thousands of people. And yet, even though many institutions are attempting to do a better job portraying the realities of slavery, there are other places that often obscure it or ignore it entirely. And it's a very surreal and confounding experience to be exploring celebratory exhibits at some of these sites while knowing the massive scale of human suffering being ignored. I thought it would be really interesting to explore this feeling in a shorter narrative teaser game that visited Blackhaven Hall as it might be depicted in a similar present-day museum. As a tiny studio working on a sensitive topic for our first game, I also thought this might provide a gentle way to introduce the topic to players. And I was inspired by the success of free narrative games like Marie's Room and the reception that they'd received on Steam. In the story of Cassius, Blackhaven Hall is the ancestral home of the Harwood family, led in the Revolutionary era by patriarch Thomas Harwood. Thomas is an American revolutionary and an Enlightenment dabbler, and like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, his wealth depended on the hundreds of people he had enslaved. Blackhaven Hall is burned to the ground by British soldiers during the American Revolution, leaving a site of ruins that look very much like these real-life ones from Roswell Plantation in Virginia. When I began thinking about how to design Blackhaven's fictional museum, it was important that this environment feel realistic and grounded, even pedestrian. Without the cost of materials, many game museums are like this, at monumental scales. But I did a lot of research on cost-effective architecture and mundane details. The dated and dull museum design places the structure in about the early 70s or so, and I thus began thinking about how to convey an entire institutional history spanning different eras. I created backstory for decades of the museum and its directors, some of which were added to this in-game sign. The sense of time was also reflected in details like marketing posters on display in the museum offices, all based on surviving 20th century designs, and the different books for sale in the gift shop. By far the biggest contrast between eras was in the ruins of Blackhaven itself, which in the game had recently been transformed into a slick modern steel and glass reconstruction. I researched a lot about structural glass projects and trying to get this look right, but it was actually directly inspired by a similar project at Minokan, another small privately managed plantation home museum. Players would explore the house while listening to a smarmy audio tour, narrated by yours truly. And here too, I tried to include a sense of the extended history. The tour guide mentions a number of folk legends about different parts of the house, and the glass structure attempted to account for realistic structural support and HVAC, although as some players had mentioned, probably correctly, that this space would absolutely bake in the summer. Aside from Blackhaven, trying to make Blackhaven feel like a real place, I wanted to create a sense of uneasiness in the game for players even before they uncovered the museum's worst secrets. Throughout the displays and audio tours, enslaved people are euphemistically referred to as servants. A family portrait featuring an enslaved woman crops her out when duplicated on a book cover. The same gift shop features thoughtless marketing slogans, like the ones for these very unique dolls, and this book cover, which show that they don't expect diverse visitors. And a fully readable, illustrated children's book not only praises the Harwood family's patriotism, but also the undeserved devotion of their put-upon worker, Farmer Joe, while totally omitting the presence, contributions, and hardships of Black Americans entirely. About halfway through the game, Players are tasked with scanning documents in the archive. After noticing some discrepancies, they find a trove of incriminating and disturbing evidence that forms the most important part of Blackhaven. In this section, our narrative team had a set of historical educational messages we wanted the game to convey. First, we wanted to show the real and meaningful harm resulting from Blackhaven's involvement with slavery and segregation, neither sanitizing this difficult history nor exploitatively dwelling on every gruesome detail. Second, to show that these harms have persisted to the present day and how the museum and the Harwood family have enabled this legacy. Third, and finally, that in every era, there were Black Americans actively resisting and trying to make the best lives for themselves and their families, even if these efforts were not always successful. Each of the game's documents were based incredibly closely on existing historical records. A missing page of Thomas Harwood's diary reveals a particularly cruel incident between him and an enslaved mother, and both the violence and his writing style were taken directly from the real-life Virginian enslaver, William Byrd II. When trying to mimic a historical voice, I looked closely at sentence structure and especially word choice, sometimes searching for particular terms in the Google Ngram tool to make sure that they were period correct. And perhaps the game's most disturbing example, players read love letters between the Civil War-era spouses Gideon and Anna Harwood. Anna Harwood's writing is full of petty complaints and offensive language about her enslaved house staff, taking plenty of attitude from the even more explicit and unsettling diary of real slaveholding wife Mary Chestnut. Confederate soldier Gideon Harwood at first seems more compassionate of the couple before confessing his role in the grisly murder of Black Union prisoners of war, with some of the confession lifted from surviving accounts of Nathan Bedford Forrest's role in the Fort Pillow Massacre depicted here. The documents also show how Blackhaven began rewriting its own history well before the present day. Players read through a commemorative speech dedicating a statue of Gideon Harwood with treacly, florid language and overt affirmations of white supremacy. The address was inspired by a real-life one given at the dedication of the so-called Silent Sam Confederate Monument, which was only recently removed from the campus of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The game also features a bizarre catechism intended to instruct children visiting Blackhaven. It contains a series of questions and answers, brazenly distorting Blackhaven's history, but was adapted word for word in some places from similar real-life documents once produced by the Daughters of the Confederacy organization. But so too do players find evidence of Black resistance and perseverance, from a newspaper ad placed by newly freed slaves attempting to reconnect with lost relatives, to the mid-20th century inquiries of the fictional Dorothy Mitchell, a local activist and amateur historian who applies to research in Blackhaven's archives. Mitchell believes that she may be descended from an illegitimate mixed-race child of Blackhaven's William Harwood, and this not only gives players a historical mystery to solve, but also mirrors the centuries-long pursuit of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and the underage enslaved Sally Hemings to confirm their ancestry, which they eventually achieved through DNA testing. So now we had a realistic museum environment with a rich and troubled history, but because these subjects were so sensitive, we weren't sure we could give players the freedom to explore these places without context. We needed instead to have them play as a protagonist who could push back against Blackhaven's distortions, and it made sense for the character to take on multiple roles as an outsider. To that end, I began sketching the character of Kendra Turner, a young Black woman attending an HBCU, or historically Black college and university, and working at Blackhaven as a summer marketing intern, often relegated to the front desk, as she does in this game, serving on a holiday. But Kendra's perspective was not one that was part of my life experience, nor one that could be uncovered through historical research. Blackhaven needed to collaborate with people who shared Kendra's real-world experiences. At this point, the advisory board I'd been working with on Cassius and Blackhaven suggested that I contact Dr. Sharon Roberts, a media scholar at Xavier University of Louisiana, who could help consult on the HBCU experience. I talked through the outline of Blackhaven with Sharon and Charlene Senegal-Decour, one of Xavier's historians, and we settled on a plan. We would convene a panel of women Xavier students who shared Kendra's identity and do a table read of the script of Blackhaven. These students would not be previously familiar with the museum exhibits or the historical documents, and we would take note of and discuss their reactions to everything the character of Kendra would see and take their input on how they thought she might react. Finally, and most importantly, While we would ask the students for their input on every aspect of the game, we would specifically give them the final say on the character of Kendra and all of her dialogue. What followed was an incredibly rewarding and illuminating experience. The student team, consisting of Tyra Johnson, Naomi Winston, and Tia Alphonse, were passionate and vocal throughout the discussion, both on small details and big themes. On the lighter side, they discussed Kendra's hair, with at least 2 of the group advocating for the hairstyle that they themselves had. This is what we went with. There were spirited discussions about what slang and phrasing was accurate for a college-age woman. In one case, hashing out regional differences between that used in New Orleans, where many of them went to school, and those that would be likely used in Virginia, where Kendra had grown up. The students also gave very valuable feedback on much more consequential things. They discussed the many micro and even macro aggressions that Kendra experiences as a woman in a primarily white space. For instance, when Kendra arrives, she receives an email from her boss with strict, patronizing instructions for her dress, hairstyle, and speech. But players can also find the welcome letter to Catherine, the previous summer's white summer intern. In it, the same boss is now warm and gregarious, showing none of the suspicion that she does towards Kendra. The team also weighed in on some of the ugliest parts of Blackhaven. We had an extended discussion about the use of racial slurs in the game's documents, particularly the Civil War letters from the Harwoods. I mentioned that Mary Chestnut's diary often had even more frequently offensive language, but equally acknowledged that our future Black players of the game might be put off by being bombarded with harsh language they were already far too familiar with when trying to enjoy a video game. After discussing a variety of perspectives from the students and faculty, we settled on the game's current balance. Exemplifying this discussion is the final letter from the character of Anna. In it, she uses one of the ugliest racial slurs possible, but because the copy the player is reading in the archives has been transcribed from the original letter, the slur is dashed out after the first letter, sparing the player the full impact, but also showing that even Blackhaven's typist felt uncomfortable copying the exact text. The final piece of the puzzle in bringing Kendra to life was casting the right actress. Dr. Roberts had suggested that a former Xavier student of hers, Darby Farr, who was pursuing an acting career, might be a possible option. I read over Zoom with Darby for the part and was so impressed with her impromptu audition that I offered her the part without reading another actor. The decision proved crucial, as Darby's performance was one of the most consistently praised aspects of Blackhaven, giving Kendra the empathy that would allow players to feel the gravity of the situation, but also bringing a feisty wit to the character that empowered Kendra as the story progressed. So now we had a thoughtful, even timely narrative dealing with some important historical issues. But how do we do as a game? Let's talk about the release, some mistakes we made and challenges that we faced, and in the end, where we think we succeeded. We released Blackhaven last July for PC on Steam. Because of the sensitivity of the subject, we didn't feel like doing a lot of the rah-rah guerrilla marketing often recommended to new studios. And so the game was released with very little advance word beyond posts on our existing social media and Reddit. I sent press releases to probably about 200 journalists seeking coverage, and while early on attention from games media was hard to come by, we did better initially with traditional media outlets like NPR and Smithsonian Magazine, who were attracted to the game's historical significance. One second. In the first couple of weeks, we also were helped by a couple of positive reviews from smaller games press and overall good reactions from Steam reviewers. Our biggest media coverage came from a feature story in Polygon, which contrasted our team's approach to historical gaming with the very mixed reception of Fortnite's Martin Luther King interactive experience. I should mention that while this media coverage was very helpful with legitimizing Historiated, as well as providing some very unique networking opportunities, we didn't see a large bump in downloads connected to particular coverage. So how did our game do with players? As of today, Blackhaven has been played by over 30,000 players in over 90 countries. The game currently holds an 80% positive rating on Steam, which places it in the very positive category. This fell quite a bit short of some of the free walking sims that had inspired us to release Blackhaven, but at the same time, the game was one of the most publicly successful humanities-themed games ever to come out of the Academy. Finally, the game has done very well with indie festivals and awards. Blackhaven was an official IndieCade selection, was initially nominated for the Impact Game and Narrative Game Awards and won a Grand Jury Award for Innovation and Experience Design. Blackhaven was also nominated or named an honorable mention in the Excellence in Narrative category at IGF, the Independent Games Festival, which of course is being celebrated this week. We saw a slight bump in downloads during festivals and after these announcements, but again, not enough to make winning awards a significant factor in the game's numerical success. Being a first-time studio, we also made plenty of mistakes, and the game also faced some unique challenges during its development, so let's highlight some of those. One difficulty we had with Blackhaven was the game's placement in relation to potential audiences. Cassius had always been planned as a relatively high-fidelity puzzle game with a Gothic atmosphere, something that might appeal to players of games like Soma and Edith Finch. Blackhaven was a far more restrained and deliberate game, but when it was stretched to over 2 hours, it was less appealing to some of the high-end gaming crowd. At the same time, many casual players who appreciate slower narratives didn't have the hardware to keep up with Blackhaven's graphics. Another aspect of this dilemma was optimization. As we thought about our recommended hardware, we thought our recommended hardware was fairly accurate, but Blackhaven being the first game that I developed as a near solo dev, the game was not especially well optimized. If player systems could run The Witcher 3, they were often very put off if Blackhaven lagged, even if their machine fell below our hardware recommendations. Both of these problems illustrate one of the contradictions of releasing a free game to boost attention. On one hand, there's a lower barrier to entry, so you can potentially reach a much larger audience. On the other hand, it means that the game will be downloaded by a large number of players who never would have paid for it. Thus, many of Blackhaven's most negative reviews came from players who clearly weren't fans of the genre but had downloaded the game on a whim. This dynamic also came through in playtesting. We had limited options with our budget, which was essentially just my professor's salary. We paid our actors, but everyone else on the project worked for free. And being at the height of COVID, we didn't feel comfortable doing a totally open beta because of the game's sensitive subject matter, so we tested mostly with friends and family, and especially students. In the game's opening section, Kendra tests an interactive quiz in Blackhaven's museum gallery designed to teach players the basics of Blackhaven's history. When my students playtested, they dutifully read the museum displays and had no trouble passing the quiz. But when Blackhaven was free to download, antsy first-person shooter fans started blazing through the gallery holding shift and were frustrated, often to the point of quitting, when the quiz answers weren't in the most prominently placed objects. A compounding error, which was totally our fault, was that there was a visual bug that made one of the quiz questions misleading, but none of our students had ever run into that because it was never an issue if you read the museum displays in order. Finally, a challenge of releasing a politically charged game is that you're going to receive some negative blowback. Overall, we were very fortunate as none of our staff received overt threats or harassment, but there were certainly Steam reviews motivated by racial resentment and even ones more or less constituting vandalism, some of which were taken down either due to moderation or community reports. Also, although in the end it's never possible to tell for sure, there were some support interactions where players were so obstinate that it was hard to believe that they weren't intentionally trolling. In all cases, the best response was to stay professional, offer as much help as time allowed, and ignore the rest. All right, so let's finish with what went right. First was the decision to trust our narrative team with the character of Kendra. In essentially every positive reaction to our game, Kendra was a major highlight. Something that particularly struck with me was how often players referred to their actions in the game in the third person, saying not, "I did this," but "Kendra did this." When streamers enjoyed the game, they'd often cheer for, root for, and even worry about Kendra. Our student team had put real pieces of themselves into our game's character, and players noticed. Second was our commitment to historical realism. Blackhaven wanted to confront players with unseemly aspects of American history they might not be familiar with. Even for the most talented writers, leaving historical portrayals to one's imagination invariably results in clumsy and even offensive inaccuracies. Instead, Blackhaven tried to let both the admirable and infamous historical actors largely speak for themselves. One other surprise was that despite the game only being available in English and its American-centric story, the geographic distributions of our downloads were very similar to other more universal indie games. which was an encouraging sign of global audiences' interest in American history. Finally, even though Blackhaven's audience wasn't gigantic, our player feedback showed us that the game made a meaningful impact on a lot of players. We got many positive reviews from all over the world, especially from people who found Kendra's experiences reminded them of their own. One Steam reviewer rated the game 10 out of 10 historian approved, while another, identifying as a black archivist from Virginia, joked Blackhaven was essentially job simulator for them and asked if we had read their emails before writing Kendra's. And despite the game not shying away from the darker aspects of history, many players from marginalized backgrounds found the game affirming. As Dr. Roberts pointed out, for some Black Americans living in the South, every day is lived as if in a museum of unpleasant history. Blackhaven could offer players a way to safely explore places they were often excluded from and work alongside Kendra to push back against the game's fictional but all too realistic historical wrongs. As for Historiated, we're still hoping to release Cassius at some point, but given the positive reaction to Blackhaven, we're considering an engine switch and expansion beyond the original game, which, thanks to Blackhaven, hasn't gotten much attention in the last 2 years. In the meantime, we'll be growing our tiny studio, and we're working on a small, all-ages VR game about Paul Revere's ride, inspired by the American Gothic artist Grant Wood's painting of the event, and that will release early next year. So, on behalf of the entire Historiated team and Kendra herself, I want to thank all of you for listening, and don't forget that you can check out Blackhaven anytime for free on Steam. One final thing, I'm a little bit hard of hearing. I'm actually deaf in my left ear, and with masks on, I'm going to save us all the trouble of skipping questions from the audience, but I'm very happy to talk to any and all of you in the hallway right after we finish. So thanks so much.